Today I'm talking to Sara Wajid, Head of Engagement at the Museum of London. We talk about how Sara brings her journalism and literary studies background to inject powerful storytelling into the project she works on, to explore and further develop decolonial methodology in both a museum and a display context. You may have noticed that Subhadra, Miranda and I have talked quite a bit about a group called Museum Detox. Well, in this episode, Sara tells us a little bit more about why she made the first phone call to bring together this group of BAME professionals from the museum sector. So this is the Museum Detox origin story. Hi Sara, it's really great to have you on the podcast today. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about what you do?
Well, my job title is Head of Engagement at the Museum of London, and that means that I'm working on the new museum, which will open in a few years' time. And I'm involved in planning and shaping and encouraging Londoners to get involved in shaping that museum.
An enormous task. Are you excited and nervous?
Yeah, it's a good crack.
Fair enough. I was really interested to find out that you had a very successful career as an arts and culture journalist before you made the move into museums, or rather museum sector generally. What made you make the jump from journalist to museums? Was there something that you felt passionate about changing, or what was it?
Well, Sushma, it was a 15-year career plan that I had sketched out at the age of 10. No, obviously, I was bumbling along doing my best as a freelance journalist to get gigs writing about the sort of things that I was passionate about, which you can imagine is to do with inequality, cultural politics, representation, things to do with literature and things that made me laugh. So that was all fine, but it doesn't earn very much and it's not very stable. And after
so you moved into the museum sector, which is notoriously very well paid and extremely stable. Oh dear.
No, but around the time I had been working in heritage a bit, sort of as one of the many other things I was sort of doing in parallel. And I'd been always pretty passionate about history and the telling of history and public history. And around that time, newspapers were imploding. So the internet has boomed, and the sort of pay-for model of like journalism, how you pay for journalism, was changing radically. So there was even less ways of basically making money as a freelance writer and because people were writing blogs for free, all of this. So basically the model was changing. And just around that same time, I guess museums were waking up to the kind of issues that I was writing about. And I just kind of accidentally stumbled into museums and was, dragged into them very forcibly by my first boss at the Royal Museums Greenwich, or National Maritime Museum as it was then, a woman called Andrea Cunningham, who spotted that, the sort of traits that you have in journalists: questioning power, truth to power, little bit of mouthiness and all of that, could be useful, in a museum. And so she kind of, maybe she groomed me into the sector.
Sounds slightly disturbing, but in the most positive way.
And also I think there was an element with when you ask questions, you're not always answering them. And I did kind of feel like sometimes it's quite lonely, and there's something, that appealed to me about collective endeavour. And also trying to build something, not just ask questions, but do things. So quite often I'd be talking to filmmakers or activists or novelists about their work, and the sort of feeling like, okay, well, I'm supporting, but I'm not actually making anything myself. I'm just a bit of a quisling. And I think I got to a point where that questioning felt like a little bit indulgent without trying to come up with some of the answers. And I suppose that was the other thing about museums. You could actually build something.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Royal Maritime Museum in Greenwich.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was at that point that you obviously founded Museum Detox, or brought together a group of BAME museum workers. What was the change you were not seeing at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich that really sort of seemed to lead you a bit more along the path of decolonising a museum? Was there a particular trigger, or...?
Well, I suppose, an organisation that the collections, the strength of the collections at the National Maritime Museum are 16th, 17th, 18th century. And that's, it's all about empire, really, is really absolutely at the heart of the collections. So working with those sort of collections day in, day out, and those stories, when I first entered the organisation, I was in a team that was very culturally diverse. and where focusing on questioning the way that the museum was engaging with stories of empire was absolutely comfortable, working together towards being progressive and changing some of these dominant narratives and questioning them, and we could laugh about them and think about them and share our thoughts very openly. But over time, some of these people left the organisation and I had started becoming a little bit more senior. You know, I was getting more access to some of the more important conversations, really. And I started to see that actually my own identity as a person of colour was changing the dynamics of the way that I was operating as a worker. I had plenty of allies, particularly in the learning department, many people who were thinking in the same way as I was thinking. But the very fact of simply being visibly different means that you are bringing yourself and your own subjectivity into those conversations differently. After some time, I started noticing, well, I've been working in museums for quite a few years now, and actually I've stopped moving quite in the circles that I was moving in before, and I'm starting to literally see the complexion of my world is becoming whiter and whiter. And that actually my identity was starting to become a bit kind of, there were issues, problematic issues for me in just negotiating and handling myself, you know, and that I was starting to feel a bit sort of tired. You know, there was this sort of strange emotional sort of exhaustion that was, you know, part of just working life in London. You know, everybody's exhausted all the time, commuting and all the rest of it, public sector and blah. But I knew that there was this extra layer going on, and I'd seen it before when I was working at the National Archives for a year on a project about migration history, and I just recognised it more quickly because I'd seen it before. And those in that project at the National Archives, I would feel quite emotional about subjects that I could see other colleagues were fairly dispassionate about, and things that were really cutting me up would be like an emotional sort of sledgehammer in the middle of my day coming across certain types of documentation that I found just racist and that were exposing the British state as being institutionally racist. You know, it's hard to just kind of crack on with your emails after you've written that.
Yeah,
read that
and
kind
especially
of stuff.
when you don't see it displayed in the museum as well.
That's right.
When it sort of stays in the archive, it stays among the collections and it stays among only conversations with your colleagues and other people in the sector. It's almost more frustrating and more difficult. And cumulatively, I think it gets harder and harder to engage with colleagues and the collections as well. I mean, recently they've done some amazing new galleries. They're really exciting. I went to visit them and I really enjoyed them. I enjoyed them. I think a lot of them were very challenging and rightly so. I had to work hard to go through some of those galleries. I just wondered, at what stage was it that you wanted to see the changes that you were thinking about?
I think so many of us working in the sector, and particularly people of colour, want to see better representation, fairer representations, a more honest reckoning with empire. And, you know, it's one of the reasons I should have said earlier, one of the reasons why museums attract me is because they are very important public memory machines.
Absolutely.
And national sort of narratives. And I did my studies in literary studies, so the importance of stories and publicly official stories, and you know, that sort of, I suppose it sits on the axis of my interest in language and storytelling and in power and equality and politics, and so museums are the perfect sort of, you know, 3D storytelling machines for that. So right from the start, of course, you're looking at galleries and thinking, hey, you know,
how do we change this?
Yeah.
Or how do we bring in other narratives? So what do you feel were your biggest successes there? I mean, at what moment did you feel really proud of what you'd achieved?
That's interesting, actually, because I don't think I, on a day-to-day, was at that point particularly sort of conscious of myself as a museum professional. I quite often would just sort of think of myself as a generic, you know,
museum bod.
Well, not even a museum bod. For many years, I just thought of myself as a journalist who was accidentally spending some time in a museum job. So I think it takes a while to take yourself seriously. You know, like the curators, they seem to be like museum professionals. Or
I feel very professional at all times.
or those, the people with museum learning degrees and specialists in sort of object handling or conservators. That's museum professional. I'm just a sort of self-appointed busybody who happens to have washed up here in museums for a bit. And so in terms of like things that I was proud of, I suppose it was more about like being part of a team that were very clearly trying to bring change and bring participatory practice and question these very difficult histories and sort of question the way that we were managing that. And that was all part of a broader sort of mission that the learning team had. It certainly wasn't me pushing against the grain of the learning team. The learning team were all quite kind of, we were part of a collective push within the organisation for that kind of work. And by no means that there weren't people outside of the learning team interested in that either. But I think I come back to this issue of what it's like, your day-to-day experience as a person of colour. And I think that is a really under-recognised phenomenon, and we don't speak about it. Where are you going to speak about that? In a meeting? Are you suddenly going to draw more attention even to the fact that you're the only non-white person in a room of 20 people around a board table? How many times are you going to say that, and how's it going to help you? It's very self-evident. And I suppose that was the thing, that there came a day when I just felt like I don't know why or what, but I need that feeling back. But when I started here, and there was a lot of us that we could have like that shared sort of
honest
lived experience, very honest conversations and shorthands without worrying about
having to explain the epic background to something and sort of hurting somebody's feelings, and
without what I've now learned to call white fragility, without thinking about that. There's another, work is busy. You need to be able to get on with the conversation, exactly. And so I think I was thinking back to, where are those other people? I need that feeling back. So I was actually trying to recreate something that I'd already had at Greenwich. By just reaching out and trying to find those people in other museums who I felt must be having a similar experience. And that's all it was just a very simple impulse to...
Well, it's a pretty big success. I mean, I find it very helpful. I mean, you tweeted yesterday and you mentioned the importance of the quiet activism and the support that is not visible to other people at all. And yet, for me, that's, I think, the most important thing about Museum Detox, actually. It's being able to, send someone a quick WhatsApp or something and just say, oh my good God, just please, just any message would be really welcome right now. And it comes. And I think that's what's so great about that, actually. So I think that's a pretty good achievement.
Well, very collective.
Absolutely.
Very collective. It's just that if nobody had answered that call out, there would have been...
You sitting at the pub by yourself.
Indeed.
So from Greenwich, you made quite a big jump, and you became an arts council funded, or no, arts fund?
Yeah, so I went to Birmingham. That's right. Yeah,
as a change maker.
Yeah.
So what is a change maker?
A change maker.
Yes.
Crusader. Well, I mean, I think it was meeting people like you and other people at other museums who I could see were these proper museum professionals. And I started to sort of recognise myself as having some sort of expertise. That when this opportunity came up, basically for state-sponsored museum activists, essentially, it was a leadership scheme for both disabled and Black, Asian, minority ethnic people who are the most sort of underrepresented of those people with protected characteristics in leadership roles in museums. So this was quite an ambitious scheme on behalf of the Arts Council to place 20 people for over a year in new host organisations and equip them essentially to think about the next level up in their leadership, and I'd already been fortunate to have gone on a CLAW short course by then, so I was kind of, the language of leadership didn't sound so alien to me. But my first thought was not really that I would apply for it, because I was still pretty interested in what was happening in Greenwich. New galleries were being built and stuff like this. So, but I thought, this is going to be wicked for like the people who are in Museum Detox. Let's get together and have a conversation about it. So it was then that we, as a group, sat round at the Sir John Soane Museum one evening and discussed what is this thing? Who's going to go for it? Let's all go for it. And people started saying, oh, no, I'm not sure, though. It sounds a bit like, what are you going to do? You're just going to like rock up in this random organisation and be some sort of like black caped crusader whose job it is to like, you know, it's already hard enough doing that in our own organisations, let alone turning up as self-appointed, like people are going to, you know, how are people going to react to that? I'm here to save you. No, thanks. So
the black saviour complex.
Exactly, you know, so a bit of mixed feelings. But then, you know, we all nudged each other, and a few of us did end up applying, and I was lucky enough to get through. And I was particularly lucky to get to Birmingham Museum Art Gallery because I've barely been out of London, to tell you the truth, you know. And Birmingham was such a shot in the arm. And one of the reasons I wanted to go there was because I'd been reading about some of the cultural movements, basically, and political movements that were coming out of Birmingham University. And these were some of the people who were spearheading work around decolonising cultural organisations and curriculums were there. And I could kind of, when I went to meet the people at the museum, I got a sense of the city, you know, just the energy of the city. It's a very young city. And I remember walking out of the station and looking around and just feeling the culture, you know, just seeing so many young people, so many people sort of confident, strutting, young, urban people of, you know, and you'd think that this sounds crazy, it's coming from London, that like I'm some sort of like little country mouse who's never seen multicultural urban environments before. But nevertheless, you know, Birmingham has got something different about it. You know, the energy is very different. And I remember walking out and kind of, it was a bit like the first time I went to Durban in South Africa, which is Indian, you know, sort of Indian city, and not just, but like, you know, it's a very Indian city. And I felt like, oh, this is like, I haven't seen this before, really. I haven't felt like being kind of in the West, but in a place where people of colour are totally like, this is their city as much as anybody else's.
You need to visit Leicester, I think.
Maybe I do, yeah. And, you know, when I walked out in Birmingham, I thought, this reminded me of Durban in a good way. And I kind of felt like there's something changing in London, that this is the London that I imagined when I was a child, maybe that this is how it might go in 20 years' time, but London has become such a different city in so many other ways in the meantime, that there's so much, you know, inequality in the city, and it's so huge and it's expanded so much that sense of both being, having an identity, strong identity that I could sort of feel palpably, that the sense of place in Birmingham was really exciting. So then working at a museum which is a city museum, was really interesting, and the kind of practice I was seeing at Birmingham was also very different.
So what did you want to bring as a change maker to this museum in particular? Did you already have something in mind, or did you sort of plan to go there and see what they had going on and see how you could maybe get involved in a project?
Well, when I went to talk to them, they had a plan to build a new, basically redevelop the whole museum. And what they were particularly interested in was reorientating the museum for a younger, multicultural, urban population. The city had changed very much in 20 years and the museum hadn't kept up. And I was at that time particularly interested in interpretation, because that's something I'd been getting more involved in when I'd been at Greenwich.
Just to our audience, could you explain briefly what interpretation is? Because I think a lot of people simply don't know exactly what people who work in the interpretation department might do.
Yeah, so I always think of it as the sort of the journalist within the museum, the non-specialist who is a specialist in being a storyteller. So really that is actually a very, for someone who comes from a background in literary studies, that for me is a very potent zone of kind of cultural influence, cultural politics, like how you tell stories, whose story gets told, and being, and kind of getting right in there to interfere with the actual making of stories and the power and the politics of that.
Absolutely. I think so many times you go into a museum and whatever you read feels almost quite bland and your eyes glaze over. And it's quite interesting that the exhibition you eventually worked on there, it was one of the loudest spaces I've ever been to. And I don't mean in terms of sound, but just walking through the beautiful Pre-Raphaelite paintings and then entering this space, it just sort of hit me. It was so powerful. Not just the colour, but just the type of objects and how they were displayed. I think also how the labels were written in terms of storytelling. This was a really powerful story, and it really sort of sucker punched you. I'd read a certain rather famous review of the exhibition in a national paper, and I thought, well, that's interesting. If it's generating that kind of response in the national press, I really want to go and see it. And so off we went, and I'm so glad we did. And I found myself going around, and I took photographs of every single display and every single label, which I have to say I've never done in a museum before. So I wondered if you could please tell me more about that. And how...
So to fast forward to what we actually... you're quite right. Here I'm waffling on about this and that. What you want to hear about the past is now. Of course. And so, but all of that was a very Birmingham phenomenon, as you say, that kind of the swagger, I think, or the confidence or the kind of boldness of the exhibition that could only have happened in Birmingham at that time, in that moment. So... and I suppose that's what attracted me to it. And we didn't know what would come out. We just knew that it was high time that decolonial methodology was applied to collections. And I was very fortunate to have this particular, this space to do it in, because that's the big thing, is that often people don't have the, freedom to fail. When particularly you sort of, people are always, as they kind of start to get a bit more senior, they're like, they have higher and higher safety needs. They don't want to fail because they become more visible. And actually quite often we need, particularly around areas that are stubborn and difficult and people are scared of, we need to fail in them. So tackling questions of empire and decolonizing, we have to be sort of kind to ourselves and have those sort of safety nets. So when we had that safety net, I kind of thought, well, this is the time. If not now, when? If not me here with these people in this city in this moment, when else can we take this chance? And actually I will have failed and wasted public money if we don't do something that hadn't been seen before. And so the opportunity then presented itself to appoint a researcher. Got the chance to work with the fabulous Rachel Minot, who I was lucky to have met through Museum Detox, and then, of course, to work with the people of Birmingham itself. So Charlotte Holmes, who I also knew through Museum Detox, who works at Birmingham Museum Art Gallery, had been working with two women, Alia and Shaheen, had met Charlotte, and Charlotte said to me, look, the things you're talking about that you seem to be interested in, I think, you should check out the work of these activists who have been running this event called Decolonise, Not Diversify. I read about them, found out, met them a few times, and realised that they were really interested and equipped to bring challenge, and that also they would be great to work with. So then we asked them to, help us find and recruit other people. And eventually there was a group of 6, and they worked with myself, the curators, Rachel, so forth, the team, to look at the collections and inch forward carefully with quite a lot of trepidation, trying to understand and bring to bear what we'd been reading and knowing and understanding about decolonizing in the very, I suppose, all of us constantly with the feeling that we're kind of, this is slightly strange, a sort of sensation that we're probably going to fail in what we're doing here. This is probably sort of on some level doomed before it starts, because there are so many limitations to how you can change an exhibition development process when you're working within an institution that is mainly unchanged by what you're doing. You're still trying to make a little bubble within an infrastructure that is otherwise very set.
Absolutely, and it's very easy to burst that bubble and everything dissipate and things carry on as before. Sara, could you explain for our listeners, who may not have seen this exhibition, what exactly is The Past Is Now?
The Past Is Now was a display in one room at Birmingham Museum Art Gallery, and it was a display on the theme of empire. It was a prototype gallery. By that I mean a testing gallery in which we were going to put something that we wouldn't put in the normal try approaches that we were testing. Basically, we had permission to test. This was sort of announced as, this is a trial thing and we want you, the visitors, to respond to it. And so because of that, we had particular license. We gave ourselves license to break some of the normal museum rules and established modes of telling stories. So what you saw when you walked into this display was basically a very traditional room, high ceiling room in the museum. And one wall was a complete salon hang of art. And on the other 3 walls and in the centre of the exhibition, you saw basically objects in cases with displays and labels, and in many ways a traditional looking gallery. But in fact, when you engaged with the displays, you quite quickly discovered that this wasn't a traditional or familiar type of display, because we co-curated it with people from outside of the museum, and the aim of the exhibition was to find a new language and way of talking about collections relating to empire that applied a decolonial methodology. And so when you got up close, instead of seeing conventional sort of captions about
a particular gun that was on display, for example, at the middle of the gallery there was one gun on,
exactly. So there was one object that had a caption, a very problematic caption originally, that said something about, in reference to Kenya, this will be an amusing addition to the collection. It had blood on it, and that was a very dehumanising caption written originally in the catalogue in the 1950s. But rather than just tidying away that caption was then displayed as an object in itself, and there was a discussion about what role the museum has in perpetuating these sort of myths about the Mau Mau Rebellion. And so that was one example of the type of objects. Another object had particular critique of the role of capitalism in empire. So when you got up close to these objects, some of the interpretation or the text around them was very unusual, and for some visitors jarring, and for other visitors very welcoming. But that's what the past is now is.
I mean, you mentioned decolonisation there, and I just wondered, I've heard so many different people talk about decolonisation in very different ways. I mean, when you say decolonisation, what does that actually mean to you?
Oh, the dreaded question.
It's an interesting one. I'm putting you on the spot right here.
Yeah, and you're quite right too. Of course, I'm boringly going to say there is no simple answer and there's no one definition. But I suppose what it means for me is that for many years I'd been using thinking tools like diversity and equalities and, untold stories and hidden histories, but they were relatively sort of those
superficial.
Tools, they weren't kind of getting really to the core of what I was trying to speak about. And the other sorts of tools were more like radical feminism or Marxism and those sort of languages and discourses which I'd learnt through literary studies and post-colonial studies at SOAS and so forth when I was, a young whippersnapper.
I knew you were going to say that somehow.
Yes. and those languages are kind of Marxism and feminism and some postmodern theories, they didn't sit right for museum practice on a day-to-day basis because other people didn't speak that language. Basically, there was no point talking to a curator of ship models and saying, I just want to talk to you about intersectionality and kind of the Marxist feminist kind of deconstruction of this ship model.
The veil would come down.
Exactly, and it's not that decolonising is suddenly a way to punch through all of that, but it's when you apply specifically the idea of thinking about knowledge production to museums, that is much clearer to most people, that there is something deep in the fundamental origins, the sort of epistemological origins, to use a long word there, of museums, is that they're about taxonomy, they're about categorization. It was born in the Enlightenment period, the desire to categorize, understand, contain other worlds for the West is kind of what museums were born out of, the need to understand and diagnose and analyze and really dominate other cultures and bring them in and bring them home to learn from and make money from them is kind of what's at the heart, to put it simply. And so when you're working with those tools, in so many ways, the collection is against you if you're just trying to tell fair stories. The collection is already tainted with that kind of epistemological culture, the captions that you read, the objects that are there, the objects that aren't there, the ways the people who have power over them and have had power over them for centuries, all of that is so much more than talking about only workforce diversity or only the representation questions on the wall of the gallery. You can change all of that, but if you walk around an organisation and mostly the black people you see in that organisation are in cleaning roles or security roles, and mostly the people in power that you see are white blokes, then very the cultural DNA of that whole system is reinforcing and reproducing colonial hierarchies, essentially.
I mean, given the fact that, we're not going to change these collections overnight, they're important historic collections, at the most fundamental level, what would a decolonised gallery or museum or even a small part of that, what would it look like to you?
Well, I suppose The Past Is Now was, at that time, on my best attempt of what it looks like, not just mine, but ours collectively. And I suppose the reason I say that is that it looked like something that was honest about the pain that those collections and those histories, honest about that pain and not scared of the pain, not scared to surface it, and not so scared of the anger that they generate, and sort of claiming and owning that. I think that's why it was a very emotional gallery for a lot of people, that these were feelings that they had, but those feelings are quite often in other museums, like this one, like the British Museum, classically, this was very much a reference point for a lot of people who came to The Past Is Now. They would say, oh, why can't we see this in the British Museum? This is how I feel when I go to the British Museum, but those feelings are not validated. Those are the feelings or the voices or the things that I want to say, the criticisms or the critiques, the ways that I want to interpret those collections, but they're in my head. I have to rewrite what I see on the labels of the wall in the British Museum, but here the labels are saying those things for me. And credit to the women who co-curated the display when we, without even realising it, sometimes try to tidy away some of that pain.
You sort of do it automatically, don't you? You're so used to writing certain type of label, certain type of text, you automatically edit out words like racist or whatever you're trying to write.
That's right. And you sort of think, well, it's just,
turn it beige.
Yeah, it's a bit unpalatable. Got to make this like it's for everybody. And think about the reading age. And reading ages are important, and you do have to use non-jargonistic language. But there's a difference between making things palatable and making them accessible. And I think before we even realise it, we internalise a lot of that as practitioners, because that's what we see around us all the time, and that's what our training tells us to do, because we're institutionalised. And so credit to those women, they could see the difference between, challenging us as people and individuals and challenging the organisation. And they weren't so scared of hurting our feelings as individuals that they avoided tackling and sort of pushing back. Simply.
I think it's often easier for people who don't work in a museum, because as a professional, there are certain things that are expected of you, and to disrupt that and to even start the process of disrupting that, you always wonder what the result is going to be on, your job. If it's very insecure, then you've really got a problem. Mm-hmm. And it's easier just to shy away and go, it's fine. Let's just carry on. I'll just write this fine and it'll be fine. And nothing will change. You just can carry on your merry way.
Absolutely. And I think, emotions, you cannot take emotions out of talking about the legacies of empire. And the whole kind of culture of professionalism is that we are unemotional. Historians are unemotional. This is about evidence and facts. And so as a museum, you have authority and you have a particular position of authority, and people invest a huge amount of trust in you, which is why that Times article representing those views for people who felt like it was a terrible denigration of what museums stand for, to have something that was what they saw as partisan or partial or emotional or anti-capitalist being platformed by a museum, because that's all very well when artists do it, because everybody knows artists are renegades and mavericks, and
it's all very transient. It won't really change anything in the long term, so it's fine. Let them get on with it.
Yeah, but this display was presented pretty much as a kind of integral and permanent looking part of the museum, and that's what disturbed people. They felt that the museum should be maintaining a neutral voice, and that this departure from neutrality, which I would never have probably ventured into without collaborating with co-curators, was the thing that was disturbing, because it just goes against the authority and impartiality, objectiveness and academic kind of rigour that you expect from a museum. Why should there be emotion, and why should there be a partiality or analysis that seems partial, which of course doesn't address and doesn't recognise the fact that for many people museums feel partial, but the wrong partial. So they're not neutral for many people. That's not neutrality. They recognise so many people go to museums and say, this isn't my world you're representing. And so this was what we were trying to do with The Past Is Now. And that's what, I suppose, a serious reckoning with the past that doesn't shy away from those difficult and unpalatable, and particularly the role that museums have played themselves in perpetuating white supremacy. That's, I suppose, what a decolonial methodology can begin to look like, and it's just baby steps,
So Nick, who is our sound editor, has just come up with a really interesting question, actually, and he wondered, can working on this kind of decolonial project, which is extremely challenging, can be extremely draining, can it also be a joyful process?
Yes, The Past Is Now was also one of the most joyful projects I worked on, because it was such a huge pleasure to work with people who'd been wanting to do this and get their hands on the collections for so long, and to finally do it. There is a great relief in that, and release, and knowing that you're, I suppose for me, I was, doing it for my father's generation as well, as an act of remembrance in it. It's about memorialising and all the things and the painful experiences that, I remember from, sort of growing up in pretty racist, kind of country in the 70s and 80s. There is a healing in being able to reckon with that and put some of those things into place, which once you're a grown up and you're more empowered and you have access to the levers of power, that it's your duty to do it, and your duty and a great pleasure and relief to finally feel like you're making some changes that need to be made. So that's incredibly joyful. It's also just, sometimes it's iconoclasm is fun. Everybody likes, to kind of do that, and to kind of it's very creative. Actually decolonial methodology forces you to think more creatively as well. You're not just going through the motions of this, so you make better work, and that in itself, there's a creative pleasure to be had. It's not separate from, it's not this sort of dull worthy thing that happens over there because it ought to happen and it's noble and terrible and whatever, and then over here is a separate kind of joyful creative process. It should be something that you're working collectively, and it was also a very feminist project, and that is a very empowering thing, and that is joyful. And, some of the people I work with got brilliant sense of humour, so,
I watched the YouTube video of Shaheen talking at the Museum Next conference, and, everything from her bunting card all the way to what she was saying. She said it in a powerful way, but a very funny way, but I think it hit home harder because it was said in quite a light-hearted way in some occasions. It's not just, right, this is what you must do and this is why it was bad. And, everyone, when you're castigated again and again, you do turn off. But actually when you are presenting something that was incredible and had a real impact on your life, and you present it in quite a fun way, not silly, but, thoughtfully witty and interesting and joyful, actually. Yeah. I think, that talk stayed with me because of the way she presented it.
Yeah. And, and some of the best times I've had with people like you, and, relaxing and kicking back with, people in the Museum Detox Network. And we don't spend all day talking decolonising theory by any means.
My God. We have lives.
That's right. And that is some of that is decolonial activism in a way as well. It is just, who you choose to bond with and who you choose to relax with and spend time with changes your heart and mind, and actually laughing and, being human and being alive is all part of it.
Yeah, and also we're doing the jobs we absolutely are passionate about and love, and what is not joyful about that? Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, how do you move on from a project that's had such a massive impact on the way a lot of different people perceive museums and displays or even collections? How do you sort of, finish that project, take a deep breath, and then move on to the next one? I mean, what do you... that must have had quite a big emotional toll, actually. How do you move on from that? And what do you take away into, your next role? The one you currently do, for example.
Nice segue, Sushma.
Oh, thank you very much. I feel like a professional again.
It was emotional. It was a huge privilege to work on something with such talented people, and at a museum that was so sort of willing to go there, with the colleagues who were actually going to take a lot of the risk, people who were staying, and credit to them as well. But it wasn't easy to it was a hard act to follow. And that's why the prospect of working on developing a whole new museum at the Museum of London was it was a great thing to kind of channel that energy into, because it was also a very compelling project, to sort of prospect to work on, and to bring back what I'd sort of experienced at Birmingham to the city that I live in. You see obviously the place that you grew up in differently when you've been somewhere else.
I think what's interesting is exhibitions are so transient. You go to a lot of them, you get very excited about them, and then nothing else changes. And it seems that so many opportunities to embed some of this change that has been generated through a temporary display, it's not really taken advantage of. And so I just wonder, is this move to this museum partly a way of trying to introduce and embed this kind of change so it outlives a temporary display, it outlives you in your role, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, you put your finger on it. I suppose it could only have been the project to shape a museum from the ground up that felt like, having come out of the experiences and the sort of education that I'd had, I suppose, in Birmingham, about the limits of temporary exhibitions and the limits of partial change or incremental change, that I just felt like I'm 45. Like, my time is running out to make serious...
Not yet. 45 is not that old.
I just feel like time is running out to kind of, make change, lasting change in a sector that, I don't know how many years career I've got left, but in terms of what energy I've got and what I've learned so far, I felt like I can't do more piecemeal projects. I can't be sort of, pace of change is very slow. It's glacial in museums. The bigger the museum, the slower the change. And having kind of had this, indeed.
We might have to cut that bit out.
So having had this shot in the arm, you can't go back from something like the past is now to just fiddling around the edges. So the opportunity to kind of get into the guts of the infrastructure of a whole major new museum development, with that commitment, and that sort of lessons in integrity that I'd had there, were an opportunity that I thought, right, this is the sort of thing. This is the sort of opportunity to think deeply and sort of take a running jump up to something over many years. That is an opportunity for the whole, not only sector to learn, but for us as a generation of museum practitioners. I think we need to sort of collectively be putting our energies into really making fundamental infrastructural change to the way that we think about these things.
And it seems like such an exciting moment to do that. I think partly because we've all been brought together through Museum Detox. So you're sort of sharing knowledge, sharing information, also sharing support is really important. And it'll be interesting to see maybe in the next 5 to 10 years what the sector looks like again. It'll be interesting to sort of revisit it.
But I haven't actually answered your question.
No, that's a good point. Yeah. Come on.
So I suppose in terms of just wanted to say a little bit more, I suppose, about what it felt like afterwards, because I could see that there was a lot of, it was very inspiring to see how strongly people reacted to the exhibition, but it was also, there was also pain and things for people to reflect on, and the conversation that we had back at the museum a few months afterwards about the impact of the project and how those people who had worked on it had felt, and what people had listened and learned about it. And that was really important to me. It was sort of a whole day, and some very senior people, including the museum director, spent the day with us, and we had this very great boon of having the academic and thought leader Bernadette Lynch was facilitating that session, and she very sensitively took us through reflections about the process, and some things came up there that I think are so important, and that this very rarely happens for museums, that they very rarely give themselves the space to do the honest reflections and sort of talk about what they would have done differently and all of those sort of things. And that was almost like a therapy sort of session. And some of the conversations that I had with some of the co-curators subsequently, and the very important reflections and blog posts that were written about the museum cannot be decolonized. That takes a long time to process. It's not just, you don't just kind of go, oh yeah, got that message, yeah, cracking on. And some of the discussions I've had with many people afterwards, particularly when some people from Museum Detox came to the exhibition and talked to the co-curators about what they thought of it, and the response to that was incredibly potent emotionally session to have very senior, important curators talking to the co-curators about their vision for that exhibition and what it meant to them as professionals and how it was going to change their practice going forward in national museums. That was groundbreaking, and those were very private conversations happening behind closed doors. I won't sort of break any confidences, but that never happens. That never happens, that you get those people in powerful positions, people of colour, talking across the kind of line, across the party line, in an atmosphere of trust. And, that's where hearts and minds change. And that's what I think has been so special. And so on to what does that mean for things like projects like building the new Museum of London? What it's meant is I've been very aware of how heated and how much questions of power and conflict at the heart of decolonising, and how actually caring for workers is a very important part of all of that, and looking after myself a bit as well, and not putting yourself in a position where you're going to be too vulnerable yourself so that you can't sort of manage the work or manage the pain, essentially. Those sort of conversations. So amazingly, a couple of months ago, there was a session, not even a couple of months ago, a couple of weeks ago, really, at UCL. People from the Museum Detox Network, NEETI at the Hackney Museum, and the Social History Curators Group came together to put on a study day about decolonising social history collections. And amazingly, loads of people from the Museum of London signed up for it without my, necessarily knowing that was going to happen. And we had a sort of learning together at this sort of study day, which wasn't led by me. It was led by completely other people and some brilliant speakers on the day. And we could have a sort of in a more light, less heat sort of atmosphere, learn together, about theories, ideas that would sort of, and experiments that people had done. A lot of work has happened since the past is now that builds on that responds to it, that disagrees with it. And so we could have a discussion about that. And now we're bringing that back to the museum to start airing that with the rest of the curatorial team and other people in the museum, to start those conversations, and looking at the long history of a gallery called the London Sugar Slavery Gallery, which, interestingly enough, had been one of the main inspirations for me on working on The Past Is Now, was seeing how the London Sugar Slavery Gallery had been developed. That was co-curated with experts, academics and leading thinkers and historians from outside the museum, who we wouldn't have described it as decolonising at the time, but at that it was a groundbreaking piece of work which had a lot of decolonial methodology in it. And so now trying to see what's the next iteration. I don't know what that's going to look like, but we're certainly in a better position than we were 10 years ago to think and address those
I think
questions.
we hit upon one of the key, what I think is one of the key parts of this work is bringing in people from outside the museum. It's not just about a handful of curators or whoever else is working on a particular project. I think a lot of the excitement comes, and lots of the challenging discussions and ideas and thinking about new ways to present certain collections, ideas, histories, comes from those conversations with people outside of your institution.
Absolutely.
And from a whole range of, professional specialisms, whether it's academia, whether it's an artist, whether it's a community group even, or even, as you say, activists. I think that's when the magic seems to happen. And it's mostly exhibitions that I've seen that have come out of that spark have been the most exciting ones that always stay in my mind. So I'm really excited.
Have you
to see
worked
that.
with people beyond the museum in that way?
A little bit. So I'm working with the Manchester Museum South Asia Gallery, which is in partnership with the British Museum, and it's wonderful to be able to work with a collective of people, mostly drawn from the local community and my colleagues in the Manchester Museum as well, and just seeing a very different way to approach a museum. Not just a gallery, but an entire museum with its own incredible and evolving ethos. Because I'm an ancient historian by training, the 4th century BC is about my absolute, period of core knowledge. And so I haven't come from a museum background that deals with many contemporary collections or a lot of public engagement and that kind of practice.
You're a proper nerd, aren't you,
I'm
Sushma?
such a nerd. I'm not even wearing my glasses today. I'm really happy amongst my books writing a dry article or, any kind of article. Invigorating. It's exciting to see this work and to be able to contribute it in my way. And I'm sort of bringing some of that energy and some of those ideas back to the Houghton Gallery, which I co-curated. So we're working with members of the communities, the Sikh community in particular, to sort of stage a bit of an intervention in the gallery, and it'll be the first of a few, I hope, depending on how it works out. But to actually relook at a display which currently deals with the Sikh Empire, and it's within a much longer sort of series of history of South Asia. It sort of starts with the Paleolithic about 1.5 million years ago and brings the story up to the present day with Ravi Shankar Siddhar. I really wanted to work with the community, whoever might be interested, just to see how can we relook at this case. It's not an enormous space, but it's an important one. I've no idea what the outcome might look like. We're not limited in terms of the types of material really that can fit it. Well, as long as it can physically fit inside the case, then we're fine. Everyone is subject to certain limitations. But I'm excited to see, as a part of an ongoing project, how will this evolve? How will this work out? I honestly have no idea at all, but I'm excited by that. If that does work, there are a couple of other sections of the gallery that I'm also keen to introduce that kind of approach to. And it's not some massive radical change, but it's a really important one, I think. And it teaches me a lot about how this process works, and that will go on to influence any other work I might be doing.
I think that's really important what you said about being surprised yourself, is that, we can get a bit comfortable sometimes or complacent thinking, well, I'm a progressive, good, forward-thinking museum practitioner, and things just need to roll out the way I need them to roll out, and then everything will be better. And actually the shock of working with people who know more than you in many ways and who are bringing a different kind of challenge is questioning really genuinely being forced to question your own practice. And sometimes those surprises are nice, sometimes they are not nice. Sometimes it's really quite a shock to see how you yourself can reproduce elitist practices or look into your own unconscious biases and your own sort of just crapness, just put all that language aside.
That is fine.
Your own crapness is, and you're kind of busy poking other people all the time and being like, you need to do this better, and workforce diversity is rubbish, and that's someone else's fault, and is bringing it home to yourself, and that vulnerability. That
and also
is
self-awareness.
Yeah,
absolutely. I agree.
And you can't administer that shock yourself. You have to be open. You have to be willing to be surprised and structurally put things in place that will give that body shock to the organisation and to yourself.
But then how do you progress without those shocks? I don't think you do. I don't think you can go forward and sort of bring innovative change that the sector clearly needs without going through those massive shocks. I think they're really important, and I think, yes, they're very hard to palate, but I sort of welcome them at the same time, because otherwise I have no way of learning.
And, we're in the world. A museum should be just in the world. These are social movements, roads must fall, Black Lives Matter, everything that's happening in the world we are part of. We're just a product of our politics and our society. So it's really strange if those things don't filter into the organisation, into the work, into the exhibitions, and finally into the collections, because it's just why all these organisations should be porous, and whatever body shocks we're going through as a society, we should also be productively channeling that, and I think trying to metabolize some of that. That's what 3D public storytelling machines are for. We need these stories about ourselves to make sense of ourselves collectively. Otherwise, what's it all for?
I think also we're in danger of becoming completely irrelevant. I think if you can't link the past with the present, then there's a bit of a problem. I mean, sometimes, if you want to go and look at, ancient Egyptian collections and, you're a school child, it's fascinating, it's important. But at the same time, it tells you a really important story about our past and our relationship with Egypt and other parts of the world. And it's a great way to bring that education into a gallery, or, just to a child's attention or anyone's attention.
So whose work are you looking at the moment and thinking, I want a bit of that, or that looks like the direction I want to go in?
I recently read the article that Subhadra and Miranda wrote, and
It's all first name terms here. All these giants of decolonising. We know them all. It's just like one big happy crew. Yeah.
Happy Bain family.
Yeah. Miranda Lowe and Subhatra Das.
Yes, sorry. Yes. Yeah. It was really interesting. I sort of read the article, and this is about natural history collections. I really didn't think it would have any impact on my own work because, hey, natural history, that's not ancient history. But actually, one of the most powerful things that came out of it was I felt empowered to use the word racist. And that sounds so pathetic. It sounds like such a sort of, my God, what's wrong with you? But in my own writing, I've never used that word. And I deal quite a lot, increasingly, with the colonial reception of particular moments in antiquity. And it had just never crossed from my mind to the page. And
I completely relate to that because I remember the first time I remember using the phrase in my own mind, institutional racism, in regards to a museum. And it was a big step in my mind. I just thought, why? Something happened. I was like, this is... And I was like, oh, that is actually institutional racism. That's what that is. And it was a term that I'd associated with the police or with the army, but never with a museum. And it just took a little... It's like a door has opened in your mind to just go, like, just say it. Just what it is. Just call it.
Just say what it is.
Just
do you remember that programme catchphrase? Just say what's on the screen.
It's institutional racism.
I love it.
Yeah. That's really interesting about the Miranda and Sub's natural history paper. I think is brilliant. On that note of work that I'm looking at, to ask myself a question pompously.
Shall I ask you the question?
Go for it.
Actually, so what do you want me to ask you? So, going very well. Is there anyone's work that that you find particularly inspiring right now?
Well, as you ask, I was at the Pitt Rivers Museum earlier this week, and I saw the exhibition Land. I've mispronounced that, it's a French word, but I'm going to say it in the English way. Land, it's spelled Lande, about the Calais jungle. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating because they had made connections between colonialism, the refugee crisis, and anthropology and museums and archaeology. And those were things that I would not have connected in the way that they connected it. And they were... they were basically really clear about the fact that the people who were at Calais, they were mainly from 4 regions, Afghanistan being one of them, Sudan being another, that had been previously formerly not formal colonies, but sort of informal, like in the late end of empire, sort of, not protectorates exactly, but kind of like basically where there had been empire. And this is just a really important point. And the collections of Pitt Rivers, it's a collection that is really all about kind of imperial exploration. And so the collections reflect all of that. And so to do an exhibition today, about the kind of lives that are undocumented or the undocumented realities, and situate that in a place like Pitt Rivers that has these collections, that in itself felt like a really radical and bold move to see the story of the Calais jungle told there. And I thought they did a lot of the thinking they'd done and the way they'd worked with activists at the jungle. They were absolutely the voice of the activists, and the volunteers came through, and the inhabitants and the residents of the jungle, and the displaced people. They were so clear. You heard them. They were there with you in the room. It was their objects, all their things had been loaned. I didn't feel the hand of the museum so much at all. It was like walking into Calais, and I thought it was the practice, as I just thought things are changing. Things are changing. I wouldn't have seen this even 2 years ago. And I know that some of the curators and people had looked at the past is now and lots of other exhibitions. So that was really special to sort of see there's change afoot.
Absolutely. It also must feel wonderful to know that the exhibition you worked on is still resonating quite strongly. among other museum practitioners. I mean, just to also add, you are a trustee of the Pitt Rivers.
Yeah, I mean, I should sort of like, full...
That's a pretty amazing thing, actually.
I should, I mean, it's completely objective about the strength of the exhibition. Technically, they don't call it trustee at Pitt Rivers because it's an Oxford University museum, and so officially the trustees of the collection are like the trustees of Oxford University or something.
Oh, I see.
So they call it the Board of Visitors. But yeah, I'm associated with Pitt Rivers officially, in a sort of, and that was incredibly, kind of them to, like Laura, who's the director, to think about involving me in that. So that was also really interesting.
Do you have any influence in what kind of projects they work on, or do you have any ideas or hopes for the museum?
Well, you might have heard that Pitt Rivers has been nominated for the Art Fund Museum of the Year.
I have noticed that.
And I think that is testimony to the fact that they have been working really hard through projects like Beyond the Binary and through decolonising initiatives and leading on questions of repatriation. They've got a really bold vision there, and I take no credit for that whatsoever. I'm just like somebody who's very, very small part of, those discussions. I'm really learning a lot from what they're, attempting there. And I just think that it's really excellent that the work has been highlighted in that way through the nomination for the award, because they're not a big organisation, and they're not, famously, Pitt Rivers is known for having very, very problematic collections.
Yeah, you think about the ethnographic displays of, the shrunken heads, for example. I mean, to me, that's the enduring image of the Pitt Rivers. Although I say that, but recently I went to see an exhibition of Tibetan portraits, and it was incredible. I had actually gone to see the Women on Display exhibition, and you walk through this corridor to get to it, and I just stopped me in my tracks. And it was a series of portraits of Tibetan people taken by a Tibetan photographer, and there were two portraits side by side. So you had the person wearing, just their everyday clothes, wherever they live, whether it's Switzerland or England or China. And then next to it, the historic image you might have of someone who is Tibetan, wearing very traditional clothes, normally quite a serious expression, and in black and white. And it really stopped me in my tracks in a way that, sometimes small exhibitions do way more than a huge one. I spent ages there. My kid was running around, jumping around. I want some ice cream. And I was like, no. And I stopped, and
you have to stay and look at these shrunken heads.
Well, she's only 4, so her head's not high enough to even look over into the display cases. But no, I think there's some really exciting, innovative work being done there, actually, and I'm very excited to see the land exhibition and whatever else they have on next.
Yeah. So, like you say, I think people just have to be bold, be brave, be bold, and, start even in very difficult, inauspicious collections like the Pitt Rivers, that you have to grasp the nettle, and they have, I think it's been years and decades of work by very committed, often people like the Museum Ethnographers Group, and very committed and knowledgeable curators who have been doing this work outside of the spotlight. Things like decolonising and The Past Is Now, they don't just pop out of nowhere. They are part of a long, long evolution. But it's now come, I think, aligned with another just broader moment in social awareness about all of these issues that mean that with President like Trump in the White House, these questions, they are no longer so marginal. They come centre stage to our culture and society, So it's just high time.
Probably a lot of people, hopefully, listening.
Millions of listeners. Sushma.
Oh, naturally, of course. Yes, it's like 2.
Like my mum and your mum.
Oh, my God. But I mean, for some of the people who might be listening, maybe they're starting out in a museum career, or they've been working in a museum for a long time, and they are really excited by what they're seeing around them in other museums, and are nervous about where to even start. Because when you get something wrong, a lot of people love the opportunity to really point the finger, drag you down, laugh, and even worse, question your right to have even done something. Now, I'm not talking about just BAME people, I'm talking about anybody. What advice do you have for them? Because actually it can be incredibly scary. And the fear of failing on any stage when you have people on Twitter who are very ready with their opinions, especially on such an important topic. Do you have any advice for them?
Yeah, I suppose I do. I don't think I'm not a naturally sort of particularly brave person, and I think like you've alluded to, the solidarity of having trusted allies who you can discuss and inch forward with is the things that make you, a bit braver. We shouldn't be foolhardy. We are custodians of like very important collections, and there is a lot of trust and authority. Do have to proceed with integrity. When I say bold, I don't mean like rash. I mean like considered judgments, and those considered judgments you can only really make, I feel, in dialogue with others who are on that struggle with you, and comparing notes as you inch forward. And so getting connected for me has been, whether that's through reading essays in books like Museum Activism or whatever your specialism might be, but finding the others is what gives you a bit of more strength, and a bit of allyship and solidarity. And it is very important to be part of a sort of intellectual movement as well. You need to be stretched. You need other people to push you, and papers to read, and things to open your mind. So to proceed with and understand yourself as part of a practice, a wider practice, not just you out there on your own. It's a community of practice and practitioners. So I think that is the main thing.
Thank you. That's been really lovely. Well, it's been so wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing, your knowledge and your time, and also your experiences.
Always a massive pleasure to see you.
That was me, Sushma Jansari, talking to Sara Wajid, Head of Engagement at the Museum of London. One of the key points that really stood out for me is the incredible alchemy that results when you bring together powerful, innovative storytelling and experimentation into a museum. Also, Sara's work shows us how you can be brave when you are not naturally brave, and I'm sure that resonates among a lot of us. I mentioned in my conversation with Sara that I in fact went to this exhibition, The Past Is Now, and took photos of everything, including all the labels, in it. Well, I actually did. If you want to see all of these photographs, which were taken with my not very good camera back in the day, please go to thewonderhouse.co.uk and they're all there. This episode was produced by Nick Harris and me, Sushma Jansari. If you liked what you heard, do subscribe through the podcatcher of your choice and leave a review. There will be a new episode next week, but if you can't wait, follow the show at The Wonder House.